The Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method, BREEAM, evaluation must include a flood risk assessment. It's a thorough assessment of the risk of flooding at a location where development is being considered, taking into account both the probability of flooding and any potential negative effects on people, the environment and property. The purpose of a flood risk assessment for BREEAM is to pinpoint any possible dangers connected to a construction site and offer suggestions for lowering the risk of flooding. All potential causes of flooding, including groundwater, surface water, and flooding from rivers and the coast, should be evaluated. The location of the planned development site and the pertinent flood risk data, such as maps and historical flooding data, are identified as the first steps in the evaluation process. The risk of flooding at the location is then assessed, taking into consideration variables like the elevation, the distance from watercourses, and the drainage systems. Assessing the effects from flooding on the planned development, including any potential effects on people, the environment, and property, is the next stage. The evaluation should take into account how flooding might affect the health and safety of the occupants, the possibility of building and infrastructure damage, and the possibility of environmental contamination. The recommendations for reducing the risks connected with flooding are then made based on the assessment of the flood risk. These could involve prevention techniques like installing flood barriers or using sustainable drainage systems to control surface water flow. Alternatively, the suggestions might concentrate on lessening the effects of flooding, like the use of building materials that are flood resistant or the provision of flood warning systems. The possible effects of climate change on flood risk are taken into account in BREEAM flood risk assessments. It's crucial to take into account the possibility of more flooding because of altered rainfall patterns and rising sea levels as worry over climate change's effects grows. Therefore, the assessment should take into account the site's possible future flood risk as well as any implications to the planned development. In conclusion, a flood risk assessment for BREEAM is a thorough analysis of the flood risk connected to a location of potential development. The assessment takes into account all possible flooding causes and assesses how they might affect people, the environment and property. The risk of flooding is then reduced and mitigated using suggestions that take into consideration how climate change may affect future flood risk. Developers can contribute to sustainable development and lessen the likelihood of damage and harm from flooding by performing a flood risk assessment for BREEAM to make sure their developments are resilient to flood risk. Should your BREEAM project need a flood risk assessment, make sure you speak with our team at FPS Environmental.